Hello, I'm Saremy, and today we're going to be sewing the Cameron button-up by Helen's Closet. You can find all the steps in the description, and we're going to be following the instructions pretty closely in the same order. You can also hover over the time bar at the bottom of the screen, and you're going to see each step as a chapter, like in the timestamps that correlate with each other. You can also speed this video up, slow it down, or put on the subtitles and closed captions to follow along. I'm using a cotton lawn today with a size 14 needle and a regular thread, and I also use both fusible interfacing and fabric for the interfacing bits. Good luck, happy sewing, and I'll see you on the other side. I have all my cut pieces ready to go, and I'm going to go over them really quickly with you so you don't forget any notches or some interfacing pieces. Let's do it. All right, so we need two fronts. We have those right here. And you need two pieces of interfacing. If you've done any alterations for the lengthening or shortening of your camera, make sure that you adjust your interfacing piece so that is the correct length for your placket. You'll need one pocket, and you're going to mark the front that you want to put it on. And this is the bottom of the pocket. So make sure you put your drill hole where the pocket's going to go. And as far as notches go on the fronts, all you need is this armhole notch right here on both armholes, and then you need your notches on each of the pocket hem locations, and make sure, like I said, that you do your drill hole there for the pocket placement. Okay, for the back, you're going to need one back cut on the fold, and for this piece, you need to make sure that you mark the notch here and at the center back. So there would be one on each side of the center spot here, and you need your armhole notch. And just remember that you're going to cut this on the fold. You also need two yokes, and there's quite a few notches on this one, so don't miss any of them. You need one here at the bottom edge of the yoke. You need one at the center back neck. You need these right here on the armhole and the neckline to signify the shoulder line for the sleeve and the collar, so don't forget those as well. All right, next we need our collar and our collar stand. You're going to need two of your collar and two of your collar stand. And make sure if you're using a one-way print that you cut the collar just like this with the longer edge going down as if you're wearing the shirt, because this would get sewn to the collar stand. And this is how it's going to look when it's on the person. So you want that print right side up. And for the collar, all you need is the center notch along the curved inner edge there. On the collar stand here, you have a center notch at the curved inner edge and on the outer edge, signifying center back. You have your shoulder line right here, and you have where the collar stops right here on the collar stand. This one's really important, don't forget that one. You're also going to need one piece of interfacing in the collars for the collar stand and one piece of interfacing for the collar. For these pieces here, I'm going to be just using a really simple piece of white cotton fabric for the interfacing, whereas all the other pieces I'm going to be using a tricot. That's fusible. All right, last but not least, we have our sleeves, and you're gonna need a left and a right sleeve, so make sure you cut two that are opposite of each other. You're gonna need two of your sleeve plackets here. You're gonna need two cuffs here, and then you need two interfacings that go up halfway to the cuff here. And as far as notches go, on the cuff, you might wanna notch the center here where the fold line is. And then on the sleeve placket, why don't you hold onto this pattern piece with all of your cut pieces, and we're going to do a few things with this, and it might be handy to have this when you sew this one on. So make sure you also cut some interfacing for this little guy here. You're going to need a piece that goes between this innermost notch here and the tower right here. So that is roughly, I think, 1.5 inches by 4 3/4 inches. As far as notches go on the sleeve, you're going to need your shoulder mark right here. You're going to need your front. You're going to need your back double notch. And down here, mark your pleat, whether you want it on this side or this side of the sleeve. And then for this slit right here, just do a little nip right here at the bottom, and then maybe a pin at the top of this slit. You don't really need to mark that quite yet, because we're going to be working from the side of the placket, and we're going to be seeing that. We're not even going to be able to see the marking on the sleeve, so don't mark it at all. It'll be a little easier and give you more flexibility. All right, before we start sewing, we're going to do two minor things to our pattern pieces, and then we're going to iron on our interfacing. First thing we're going to do is, I want you to take your collar, separate one collar and the interfacing, and set those aside. Now for this one, we're going to call this our under collar, and we're going to trim around this perimeter edge here, just a little bit. So I'm going to take a ruler, and at the center, I'm not going to go any deeper than 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go 1/8 of an inch trimmed off of here to 0 at this point here. And then I'm going to carve out a little tiny bit between these 2 points here. You don't have to do this, but it's going to make your collar look a little bit nicer, and it's going to pull the under collar to the underside, and so it won't creep back out on the top side. So let's see. All right, so like I said, I'm going to trim just a tiny bit here. You can use a ruler, you can just kind of eyeball it. And now I'm going to move the collar away, and you can see exactly how much I removed there. Just this little bit of a sliver. It's thicker in the center. All right, now we're going to do the same thing here. Now, if you trim off at your point there, don't worry about it. It's going to be totally fine. Same thing here. So look at that. It's kind of thicker in the middle to nothing here and nothing at this point here. We're trying to keep our seam line the same length, but we're trying to carve out a little bit of the fabric that would just bag out underneath your collar. All right, so now we can set this aside. And what I would do is just signify this one as being different. I'm just going to pin it together. I know this one is my under collar. All right, now we can set this aside. And now on your left and right front, set your interfacing and your pocket aside. And now is your chance to decide if you want your shirt to button left over right or right over left. Now, historically speaking, women's clothing buttons right over left, which means the buttonholes are on the right front. You can button your shirt any way you like. Today we're going to sew this one with the buttonholes on the right front. And so on that right front, which is this one right here, we're going to trim a 1/2 inch off this center front edge. So let's set our left front aside, and that's the one that my pocket's going to be on. And we're going to trim a 1/2 inch off of this long edge right here. This is the buttonhole side. So if you want your buttonholes to be on the other front, trim your 1/2 inch off of that one. Just going to keep a nice parallel line right there, and now we can get rid of that. All right, now we're going to interface. Okay, so if you're using iron-on interfacing, you want to make sure you attach it to all the places that you need it, or if you're just using a non-fusible, just make sure you have all your pieces ready to go. So make sure that you have your top collar interfaced, or a piece of interfacing for it, one collar stand, so these are my 2 that are non-fusible right now. I have the cuffs interfaced halfway, so just that one long edge. And then here's this little sleeve placket that gets the interfacing between the notch and the tower right there. So make sure you do both of those. And then your center front here gets that 1 inch strip of interfacing along both center front edges there. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do before we start sewing is we're going to iron our placket. So we're going to iron this 1 inch and then 1 inch again on both fronts. So the other thing you can press right now is 3/8 of an inch along this short edge of the pocket here, and you're just going to press it just like this, and then we're going to be ready to sew that. Okay, so I have ironed my pocket. I did that 3/8 inch edge there, and I went ahead and ironed along the notch as well. And then here I have my placket turned twice at 1 inch and then ironed down, and we're ready to start sewing. Okay, are you ready to sew? Let's do it. All right, we got our back and our fronts and our yoke out right now because we're gonna stay stitch a few places. So the first place we're gonna do is we're gonna do all of our armholes, and I just want you to do that at about a 1/2 inch. The seam allowance for most of the construction is 5/8 of an inch, except for the cuff, the sleeve where the cuff is sewn, and at the collar stand, neckline. Those are all 3/8 of an inch. So, but the main construction is 5/8. So just put your stay stitch in below that mark. All right. Remember, at the neckline, you want it to be less than 3/8 of an inch. with the front that you trimmed a 1/2 inch from and will be your buttonhole placket. We're going to sew that now. So we're going to fold it along the iron lines that we have there, and we're going to secure this fold by sewing the placket there 1/4 inch away from the last fold there. So you see how it's folded back there? Now we're going to sew along, and it's going to catch that edge inside the fold. When I have these really long stretches like this, I don't really want this to kind of sag into my placket top stitching. You don't want any torquing or diagonal lines to be created. So I'm gently kind of sweeping my fabric this way as I go, because remember, the presser foot's kind of pushing the fabric toward me, and I'm trying to kind of counter that. All right. So now we're going to open up this placket just like this, and we're going to sew again down along this fold, same distance away. I like to go, if I started from the top and went down, I go from the top and go down again. I always go the same direction as the other. All right, now it's a really good idea to give this a press because it'll kind of help establish that this is the position that you want it to stay in. All right, we're going to stitch our other placket and then we're going to iron. All right, and for this one, this is your button placket. Fold it the 2 times. We're going to top stitch our placket right here to the front. Try and keep it really even. You can even line up this edge to a place on your throat plate so that you can make sure that you keep a nice parallel line. Because remember, what you're going to see on the right side is just the stitching. You're not going to see this fold. So even if the fold looks a little wiggly, make sure the stitching is parallel to that fold on this side. Remember how I was talking about torquing before? What I'd like to do now is I kind of gently pull along this edge here. You'll see me going like this, just kind of pushing it like that. And that's, again, it's counteracting the fact that the presser foot is pushing the fabric toward me. All right, now it's a really good idea to press these and kind of establish that this is what we want this placket to do from now on. All right, so on the one where we created this little tuck, let's iron this from the back side first, and we're gonna just press the shirt away from this little tuck edge. All right, and now from the right side, we'll just give it one last press. All right, and then press your other placket. All right, now it's time to attach our pocket. So get your pocket out and get the front that you're going to be putting your pocket onto. For me, that's going to be the left front. All right, we're going to hem the pocket here. And so I have this turned 3/8 of an inch and again here at 1 inch. Now, an alternative way to do this is to fold this right sides together along that notch there and sew just this little section here, just the hem right there, just sew that on either end there. I'm going to do it this way where I'm going to hem it and then I'm going to turn it when I attach it to the shirt. All right, so I like to always sew my hems for pockets and things like that from the right side. Usually it's just because I'm using a top stitch thread. And in this case, I'm not. I'm using the same thread in the top and the bottom. But it's just a habit I've gotten into. But what's great about it is that I can absolutely make sure that my stitching is parallel to the edge no matter what it looks like on this side. So I always just do it like this anyway. All right, so now we have our pocket here. And if you sewed and turned, make sure you turn those corners out and get them all pressed and ready to go. All right, so now we're going to, and if you like, you can also press around the whole edge here, just the seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch. All right, and so you're gonna line up that corner of your bottom of your pocket to the marks on the shirt. And what I like to do is just pin the pocket in a couple of places in the center there. Now I start upside down because I'm going to sew a little triangle along the top and then go down around the perimeter. And I do that because this is kind of a high stress area if you're getting in and out of your pocket. All right, so we're going to turn under this edge here. If you sewed and turned that top edge, you don't need to do that. And now I use an awl to kind of control things sometimes, so you might see me use it. And if your fabric is particularly thready or thick, or you're just having trouble getting a lot of this sticking out, what I like to do is turn down this corner right here. On this fabric, it's very easy to do this. On thicker fabrics, it can be a little bit tricky. You can use a hammer to kind of thin it out a little bit. Just be careful there, but turn in that corner there. Then that way, that little raw edge right there, especially where your notch was clipped, those little threads won't poke out the pocket. All right, so I've got my little corner turned down there. And I'm gonna start at my hem right here. I'm gonna go up, and then I'm gonna go over to the outside and then down around the perimeter. Now I'm gonna back stitch here. And I always count how many stitches I go towards this outer edge. 1, 2, it's like, I feel like I could go another half stitch, so we'll kind of walk it over a little bit. And then that way I'll try and get this triangle the same size over here. All right, and so now I'm gonna fold this under. If you've ironed yours, it's probably a lot easier. You can pin your pocket down in place as well. And now we're just gonna go around the perimeter. If you need to walk your needle into that corner, go for it. So now when you have these pointed pockets like this, you want to try and make sure that you're getting it symmetrical, right? That is kind of the trick. So I'm going to fold it a little bit there. Use my awl to make sure that's straight. And we're going to get down into that corner. And now we're going to go on this side, and I'm going to turn under this edge here. I'm always trying to straighten this little fold edge. It likes to kind of blump out. All right. I'm going to trim this little thread here. And again, I'm going to turn down this corner at the top there and then turn it along the seam line. Make sure I'm in line with that point there. We'll go up the last leg, and don't forget your triangle. So 1, 2, and remember I did kind of like a half stitch. All right, and then back down to this hem outer edge point and back stitch. There we go. We have our pocket. Trim your threads. You can press it if you like. All right, so now it's time to sew our yoke. So you're gonna get your back and your 2 yokes. The first thing we're gonna do is gonna make that pleat. The notch on either side of the center back there goes to the center back, and then it creates a pleat, just like this. Now, one way you can make sure that your pleat doesn't get all kind of higgledy-piggledy or crooked like that is you can sew a seam straight down. So put your shirt wrong sides together, line up this notch right here, and make sure that you're actually folded straight and symmetrically, because you don't want to sew this line a little bit off. It will definitely make your pleat hang weird. So we're just going to go straight down from this notch, about 3/4 of an inch. I did a little bit more, but that'll be completely fine. And then now open up your back. And then you can stick a chopstick in here or whatever you have to kind of like open it up. And then put your center notch over that seam that you just created. And make sure it's all flat and nothing is folding back here, because it kind of wants to. Kind of gives you a little edge. And now we're just going to sew across our pleat. And make sure all your raw edges up here are lined up so it doesn't hang weird. And just sew inside the seam allowance. You can press this if you like to. All right, so now our pleat is ready to go. And I kind of just say, hey, this is what we're going to do from now on. This is how you're going to be. All right, so now we have our yoke. And we're going to take our outer yoke, line it up to the back. And we're going to take our inner yoke and put the right side to the wrong side of the back. So just lay your yoke right side up, and then we're just going to lay it right on top like this. We're going to sew on this long seam here 5/8 of an inch. All right, so now we have our yoke sandwich. You'll want to backstitch here. I know you've probably noticed I don't backstitch all the time, but you're going to want to backstitch here. All right, and I'm going to get this other side lined up. I kind of use the machine as a helping hand to kind of hold my work. All right, and then we're going to look at all this. And make sure you get all 3 edges lined up. You don't want the middle of your sandwich dropping out. Give it a little tug here to get it, make sure it's staying lined up. All right, and if your fabric is particularly thick, I would recommend maybe grading the seam allowances. And I would grade the outer yoke edge and the back edge a little bit. And then when we go to top stitch it, it'll be a little less bulky. All right, so we're gonna iron our yoke. And I like to start from the back side with the ironing. I'm going to open it up a little bit, and I just kind of pull this like this, and then I push the inner yoke up. And I'm still going to hold the bottom yoke, the outer yoke there like this, and just kind of press the yoke above it. And this way I make sure I don't get like a little pleat in the seam edge there. Just like that. Try not to get wrinkles in your pleat here. All right, now let's see what it looks like on this side. Make sure you don't have any little edges there like this right there. All right, so now we know that's ironed and we're not at risk for our yoke kind of slipping down. We can top stitch this in piece now. So I'm just going to stay a little less than 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. You can do 1 row or 2 rows depending on what your look that you're going for is. And this is kind of your last step on the back yoke here, so you want to make sure is the pleat hanging the way you want. It's not kind of cockeyed or anything like that. All right, so now there's our back yoke. And now I'm going to attach the front to the yoke here, and I'm going to do something different than probably what you've seen before. I know a lot of people love the burrito method. You can totally do that. I think that's awesome. I have a slightly different method because that didn't exist when I learned how to sew yokes. So I'll show you my method here. All right, and so just remember that you're going to put this right sides together. So just take one of your fronts. Right now I have the right front. All right, and so this is how I do mine. I'm going to line up this outer edge here. And you see this one here? Now what we're going to do is we're going to just flip this around like this. Put it right sides together, so to speak. It's right side to wrong side, right? So let me show you again. So I lay my front on there, just like that. And you just got to make sure you don't get confused on what your neck edge and what your shoulder edge just is. Even if you have to do a little tiny nip on this edge here, so you know that's my shoulder edge and it's going to go to this shoulder edge here, or a marker or whatever you want to do. That was when I taught myself how to do this, I kept getting that confused. So that was one of my little tips. So, all right, so we're just going to do this. We're going to put it right sides together. Now, don't bother pinning it. It's only what, like 6 inches long. We can do this. And it's going to be really hard to pin because it's kind of an awkward thing. So just make sure though that at the neckline, you're lining up these 3 edges on the seam line. Don't match the edges, match the seam line. All right, and so just get it under the machine as fast as you can. You can straighten out these edges, flatten out these 3 layers there. Get it under there. And now we can rest easy. It's under the machine, it's secured. Stop with your needle down always. And now we're gonna do this. We're gonna start from the bottom right here, right? So we have this one, we have this one here, and then we have the trickier one. So I get these 2 nice and flat, and then this one, I kind of just hold on there as I go like this. Don't pull, because sometimes your shoulders are on the bias there. They could be cut at an angle and that'll make it stretch. All right, and so then all you do is pop it out and it's ready to go, just like that. So I'll do my other one, and you can see that it's a little faster than how I'm making it. And this time it'll be from the outer edge, not from the inner edge. You can do it from the armhole, starting from the armhole edge or the neck edge, it doesn't matter. Match my shoulders up. Make sure I flip it carefully like this. Sew on the seam line. Stack. Line it up and sew. And then pop it out. All right, and now we're going to iron our shoulders here. We're going to top stitch them to match the bottom of the yoke. All right, and so when I'm ironing the front yoke seam here, I can actually just pull on the whole thing like this. You know, I can kind of make sure I'm not going to get any little like pleats in that seam because it's all secured, right? So I can just pull on it. Okay, so we have our plackets done, we have our yokes done, back pleat, top stitching, we have our pocket, and now we can set this aside. We're going to work on our sleeves. Okay, so we're going to do the sleeve placket with the tower on here, and I think you can too. I don't want you to be nervous about this at all, I promise. Just stick with me. It's going to be totally fine. It's just a few short straight seams. That's it. All right. So we have our little placket piece here, and the thing you're going to probably want to mark on to your tower here is just this dot right here. You probably don't absolutely need to though, but it is a little bit helpful. So we'll mark it on there. And I'm just going to use a pin just like this. You don't want to use any kind of marker or pen or anything like that because this is going to be potentially visible. All right, and so same with this one here. Just stick my pin through, find another one. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to mark this box onto our placket here. And so I'm going to use something really obvious so you can see it. It's just an ultra washable Crayola marker. Make sure you use the appropriate marker for your project. So I'm going to fold this little box a little bit, just pre-fold these little edges here, the long ones. And then we're going to transfer this box onto the placket, and we're going to draw right onto the interfacing here. So I just kind of do this. So do a straight line there, right? And then I fold it along this other line just like this. And then I lift it up and see where's the top, right there. Just like that. That's all you need. You don't need the rest of the marking. All right, and then we're gonna do it again. So I just lay my piece on here. Basically, I just lift it up and fold it on those stitching lines, just like that. This time I'm gonna mark the top like this. Same thing, fold. Just like that, all right? All right, we can set this guy aside. Okay, so one thing to remember when you're doing these, because you might want, you'll probably have to look it up every single time. Maybe I can help you remember this. The tower side goes towards the front of the sleeve, always. Tall side, front, tall side, front. Just remember that. Okay, let's just grab one sleeve. For this one here, this is the back and this is the front. We're gonna flip it over. And we're gonna put it so that the right side of the placket is toward the sleeve. So let's check again here. So this is the back. So that's not gonna work. The tower will be pointing towards the back. So we're gonna grab this one here, right? Right side down. And now remember how I said just to clip that little spot where the placket's going to be sewn? And we were gonna just mark the top with a pin. Well, here it is right here. So let's just transfer this pin to the back there. And so that's the notch right there. And so now we're gonna line this box up. We're gonna center it over that notch where the slit is on the sleeve. And then you're gonna straighten your box out using that pin. So just center the box over that pin, just like that. All right, and then now you can remove that pin and then hold this down. If you wanna put it a couple pins in there so it doesn't move around, and there you go. So this is what we have. Face down, so right side to wrong side. Tower, front side of the sleeve. Here's all my pleat notches right here because they're on the back on this pattern. And now we're going to sew around this box. That's all we're gonna do. And I want you to shorten your stitch length just a tiny bit. Just something to keep it nice and tight. You want a nice crisp line. And when you shorten the stitches, that's gonna really help at the top when we turn and make our corners in our box. All right, so we're gonna go up to the top of this box. This pin right here is gonna interfere, so I'm gonna move it over. Just the ball there, there we go. Turn. And then turn and go straight down. All right, we can remove these two pins that was holding the placket to the sleeve here. And now we're gonna cut this box. You've seen these cuts before. So we're just gonna cut straight down the middle. We're gonna stop, I don't know, about a ½ inch away from there. And we're gonna cut into the corners, not too far, right? You don't wanna clip your threads. Like that. I'm gonna look on this side. It's a little easier to see because of the interfacing. There we go. All right, now we're gonna go to the iron. And we're going to iron our binding side here, and we're gonna iron these 3 sides here. We're just gonna iron the seam allowance down 3/8 of an inch. All right, so I'm gonna move this pin directionally, just point it down. Just like that. All right, and so now we're gonna iron this edge up, edge back, about 3/8 of an inch. All right, and now we're gonna work on the binding side, which is this little guy here. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna flip this like this. So let's put the sleeve wrong side up, all right? And now we're just gonna iron this placket toward the hole that we just cut, just like that. And we're gonna do the same thing with the long side too. We're doing multiple things at once at the same time here. Just like that, right? And now we're gonna flip it all to the right side, okay? Don't fret if your little hole there looks a little messy. It's gonna be okay, all right? All right, and so now what we're aiming for here now is we're going to bind this edge here, and basically all we're doing, we're just hemming it. So meaning we're gonna hem this little short edge here without the tower, all right? So this is what's gonna happen. Once this is all said and done, this right here, this little raw edge, is going to actually lay flat toward the opening of the sleeve. Now I know that I ironed it there, and that's great. You want this to be nice and flat, right? Okay, so let's make sure that's still pressed toward the opening there. And basically you're just gonna hem this over the edge, just like this. So you can fold this and meet the raw edges just like that. Start that way, and we'll iron, right? It's gonna be a little awkward at the top. Just do your best. See, look at that. I just kind of pivoted that out of the way, right? And now we're gonna iron it again over the stitch line. You're the boss, so just make sure that you let it know that. This fabric that I'm using is super cooperative. So take your time if you're using something like a flannel that's a little bit threadier, or a linen that wants to grow and get bigger on you. You tell it no. All right, so now when you have this folded right here and it's kind of, you know, like it's binding, right? So you see that? That's the seam we sewed. The sleeve isn't bending, it's just the placket here that's bending. So fold, fold around that edge there. And when you do that, it creates a pleat at the top here. You see that? That is normal, that is okay. And I'll show you closer when we get to the machine too. All right, so we're gonna do that. And now we're gonna do kind of the same thing over here. So if you need to iron this little top edge of your opening there, go for it. It may need a little bit of taming. All right, and so same thing. We're kind of just hemming it over that raw edge like that. See? So when I say that the sleeve doesn't bend, that the placket's bending, it's true. See, like here's your cut edge. This is the sleeve, this is the sleeve, that's the sleeve there. That just got slit up and it stays that way forever. It's just the placket doing all this crazy folding. All right, and so on this side here, we fold this ironed edge. All right, and on this side here, remember, we're going to fold this, cover the stitches up. Just go just past it, iron it down. Don't uniron your little creases up here at the top. All right, and so what I like to do is kind of take the sleeve, see how I have it right side up, fold it right here, and let it kind of bend back so you can just see this top placket here. And then you can kind of refold these little angles that we added right at the beginning, just like that. Some fabrics won't be as cooperative as this, and that's okay. All right, so let's sew this one and let's show you a closer look. Okay, so I've zoomed in a little bit here, or a lot, and this is what we have going on here. So remember, the sleeve is still ironed so that it's flat. It's only this placket that's folding. So we're going to fold this binding edge over those stitches, that stitch line there, and we're going to stitch that down. And so if you want to put a couple pins in there to hold it, go for it. Just like this. Go across like that. I'm going to go from the bottom up. It's a little easier to manage. So just remember, you're trying to cover that stitching right there. That first thing we sewed, all right? I still have the shorter stitch length. It's up to you if you want to keep it still. I'm going to keep mine on because it'll be a little bit nicer, especially on this particular fabric. All right, so now we're getting up here. We have that weird pleat. That is completely fine. So don't stitch too far past your opening here. Just stitch like about to that opening and then stop right there. All right, and so here's what it looks like. All right, so we have this little pleat right here. That's gonna be fine. No one's gonna see that. All right, and so now on this side here, we're going to fold this over. And we're gonna sew straight up. We're gonna go all the way up to the top across. We're gonna stitch down our little box here and then go down to secure all of this inside. So let me show you that. And we'll pin a few things here. So this little dot right here, that is supposed to line up with the top of the box opening here. And the reason you have that is so you know when you come down here when to go across and kind of enclose all of that stuff. All right, so we're going to, right now, just focus on getting this little folded edge just past that stitch line. Don't worry about anything else right now. So just put a few pins in there like that. Don't pin the other side of the sleeve. Keep it free like that, all right? So now you have those two there. All right, and so now I want you to lay this so that the sleeve is nice and relaxed and flat, okay? Now if you need to, pin your sleeve shut so that this doesn't pull and create a problem for you. You can even just pin it along this fold edge over here. Keep that pin out of the way. That's that orange one here, all right? So right now, the two green ones here are holding down this edge. We're gonna go up, across this point, down to where this orange pin is, and across. That's the goal, all right? And so look at what's happening here. So remember, the key here is that the sleeve is completely relaxed. We didn't do anything to it. All we did is we're adding this little fancy folded placket thingy, right? And so when it's all folded correctly, look at what's going on in there. Do you see that? There's a lot going on in there. And that's all okay. Nobody's going to see that because once we've stitched across this and across that, it's going to be enclosed in there. Just like that. All right. So if you want to pin all this up here at the top, go for it. I'm just going to kind of make sure everything's looking okay. I want the little house at the top, the roof here, to be symmetrical. So maybe I'll look at it and make sure if I need to iron it. When I pick this up and pull it away from the shirt, it sometimes will distort this edge right here. So don't let that happen. Press this down like this. And then see, is it still okay? Because look, mine still is okay. But that's something I've figured out that I start trying to fiddle with it. And look, it's pulling because it's attached right there. So let it relax, just like that. All right, so now I have my house pinned there. Okay, so remember this is my loose edge. I'm gonna go up, over the roof, and then across, basically across the front door. Don't do a very long back tack because you don't want these stitches to poke up out of the seam when you sew your cuff on. So keep it nice and clean. All right, so we're stitching across, and this isn't gonna get caught because it is separate. We just pinned it shut so that it doesn't distort it. All right, so now we're getting close to the top there, and now we're looking at our little house, and you see how this little bit peeking out? So let's just poke that in there. And I'm gonna start taking my pins out. Oh, I lost this one here. So if you lose this pin, I'm gonna show you what to do. I take my pins out too because I want the fabric to start relaxing, especially with this lightweight fabric. All right, so I lost my little pin where that's gonna go across. So let's lift this up here and we'll look for our hole, and it's right here. And I'm just looking for where that box was. I'll walk my last stitch here to kind of get it more exact. Now I'm gonna go down to where this pin is, and I'm gonna go cross and back stitch. Make sure everything is all nice and relaxed. just like that. All right, let's see how I did. All right, so there we go. We have one little thread here, but that was from my back stitch from before. So let's trim that. Like that. So that's what it looks like. It'll be nicer when it's pressed. And then this is the inside. Nice and clean. So trim your threads inside here. And there we go. There's your first placket. All right, so now let's stitch our pleat down here and then we'll do our other placket. And so you should have 4 notches here, 1 pleat here and 1 pleat here. And we're going to take this one to here, this one to here. We're going toward the sleeve. So I'm going to just fold it like that. Try and keep your pleats nice and parallel, like the folds, because then they won't kind of do this, kind of sag open. All right, and so this is only a 3/8 inch seam here where the cuff attaches, so make sure that when you put your stay stitch in, you stay inside that. All right, I'm going to pin this other pleat. All right, and so now we have our two pleats here. I'm going to trim this little tail that my machine loves to leave. And there we go. And so just note that a lot of shirts have the pleats on this side and they go that way with the placket when you button it. So you can do it either way. This is how this shirt's designed here. So I'm going with the directions. Okay, so this is my right sleeve. So this is the front and this is the back. And we're going to place our tower placket face down. And remember, here's where the pin is, where the top of the box is. And then here's the notch, that's the center. So that was that slit line on the sleeve. And so I'm going to center that on this box and then make the box centered on that pin. And I'm just going to get rid of this pin. And we're going to just secure our placket there. Now we're going to stitch around this box here. And again, this is when I like to decrease my stitch length. All right, so slice up, make your Y. I always look at the other side to double check if I got close enough because it's a little easier to see. All right, now we're gonna iron. All right, and so the first thing we're gonna do is just iron each side of the placket toward the box that we just sewed. Like that. Make sure the seam allowance stays toward the box, right there, see it? All right, now we'll flip it to the right side. Pull your placket. And now we're going to iron this long edge of this placket and then these 2 angled edges of the tower. So turn it under about 3/8 or 1/4, whatever you did on the other side. And then now do the same thing on each angle. Make sure you keep this parallel, this little edge. It's so tiny that even just a tiny bit will make your point asymmetrical. So just take a little care. You can draw it on there with that scoring tool or a marking implement. All right, so now we have our placket ironed there. All right, and so now this little one, all right, and so now we're going to fold this binding edge here. So remember, meet your raw edges like that. Makes it a little easier. Just pick this all up and move it out of the way if it starts becoming a problem. This started to uniron there, so let's do that. Now we're going to fold this long edge over the stitching, right? And now iron it down. All right, you're going to get that little pleat, and that's okay. Nobody knows. All right, and on the tower side, we're going to fold this to that stitch line, kind of just like what we did on the other. Make sure you're not torquing it or getting any diagonal lines. Just remember, this is a little fussy, and that is just how it is. So just, you know, grin and bear it. All right, so make sure. All right, and so now let's just look at the whole thing. Now remember, the shirt is always relaxed when it's flat. Let's re-iron this right here since I got a little crease. Oops. Get this nice and flat like that, and then let's look at our angles up there. And remember, if you need to iron this little triangle, go for it. You know, you can just kind of press it into submission. All right, and so look at these little angles here. Make sure they're still symmetrical. Give it a good press again. And now let's go stitch it down. Okay, so we did all of our ironing here. So now let's stitch this binding side, which we're just going to hem it over there. And remember, you know, no one's going to see the inside, so don't worry about landing on the back. Just look at it from the front. And on top of that, no one's going to even see the side of the placket because it's the tower side is going to be covering it up, right? So we're just going to stitch along that narrow edge straight up and then back stitch, you know, somewhere around the top where the box is, which leaves a little bit of extra of the little placket folded pieces right here unsewn. That's okay. All right, so now we're going to lay this down, and like I said, always keep your shirt nice and relaxed. So I'm gonna pin it shut again, just along this long edge here. And now we're gonna go up this unsewn edge and across, and then along the roof, down to this pin and over. All right, there's one point, and I don't know if you can tell, but there's a little bit of my folds trying to peek out, so I'm just tucking it in there. Turn, go along the roof. Same thing, look at this little edge trying to peek out here. Just tuck that in there. You're the boss, it's this little piece of interfacing. Just tuck it in there, just like that. All right, and so here's my pin, and so I'm just gonna take it out and just pin across right there, just so I know where to turn. All right, I'm gonna take my pin out, and now I'm just gonna go straight across. Now, this might be a little bit like slack right here, right? So if you need to, kind of push the fabric toward the needle a little bit to kind of ease it in there so you don't get a little tuck at the very end. Right here. All right, let's see how I did. There's the inside or the opening, and then here's the back side there. All right, and so then make sure you trim all these little back stitches. I know right where my machine puts them. All right, and so now we're going to do our pleats again. So it's on the back side here. Let's trim this. All these little thread tails, better to get rid of them now because they're just going to plague you when we do the cuff. So just get rid of them now. All right, and so now we're going to line up these notches. And same with this one here. I always pinch it like this so that it's going to be a nice straight pleat. And then stitch inside that seam allowance. There we go. All right, now we're ready to put our cuffs on. All right, how are we doing? We're getting there. We just got through one of the hardest parts, so I think that you're in really good shape. So now we're going to do the underarm seam of the sleeve because we can't put the cuff on until we do. And I think it's easier to have the sleeve fully assembled before it goes to the shirt. I'm a big fan of setting a sleeve in, and it makes it a little easier to handle the cuff when the sleeve's off the garment. So first, we're going to do our underarm seam. Now, if you're going to just do a zigzag as your finishing stitch or overlock, what you're going to do is you're going to put your sleeve underarm here, right sides together, and sew your underarm seam and finish it how you want. I'm going to use French seams today, and on the Helen's Closet blog, you can find a tutorial on flat felled seams. All right, so I'm going to do French seams. It's kind of my favorite seam finish these days. So I'm going to put it wrong sides together. My first pass is going to be at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I especially like French seams or flat felled seams on a shirt because there's really so few seams that are exposed. It's kind of the least amount that you have to do those seam finishes on a project because there's only a couple. There's only the underarm and the side seam and the sleeve to the armhole. All right, so let's do both of these. I always kind of get it going, match it up, match the rest, and then keep going. All right, and so if your fabric is particularly thready, you're probably going to have to trim this here. And so I usually like using a rotary knife, but you're going to see me use scissors today since we're here on camera. And I'm just going to trim these down a tiny bit. I'm usually a lot straighter. All right, now we're going to iron this seam and get it ready for the last pass. All right, armhole or underarm seams are always a little awkward. So what I do is I kind of just open up the sleeve like this and I bias that seam towards one side here. And then I pull on it as I iron and just press the seam allowance one direction. It doesn't matter which direction. I'm pressing it away from me right now. Just make sure that you press it one direction. All right, and now turn the sleeve inside out. And now line up that seam line right here, right on the edge. It should be really easy because you just did that first step. You think you're going to save yourself time by skipping that first step. It ends up being harder to do this part. So just do that first one. I was a chronic step skipper, so I know. All right, so now same thing on this one. I pull really tight. I don't know if you can tell, but I pull pretty hard. I want it really, really flat. And that way, when I do this, it'll be so nice on the inside when I go to do this last seam. All right, so now we're gonna do this last stitch. All right, and so now we have 3/8 of an inch left of our seam allowance, and we're gonna sew that. I sort of kind of hold it all nice and flat, and I'm just kind of gently tugging. There we go, really nice French seam. All right, now we're ready for our cuff. I do this a little bit differently than most instructions. I'm always looking for the easiest and fastest way to do things. And I feel like this way, and also the least stressful. So what I like to do is, I like to start the cuff from the inside of the garment like this. I'm gonna sew this, I'm actually gonna sew the uninterfaced edge, right side to the wrong side of the sleeve here, just like this. and then I'll turn it and finish it on the right side. Okay, so we've got our sleeve inside out. I don't have a free arm, so I have to sew, like physically sew from the inside of the sleeve so that I'm not accidentally sewing on the other side of the sleeve because it gets caught under my needle, right? So I have the uninterfaced edge of the cuff on this edge. I have it right side up. I have the wrong side of my sleeve going to the cuff. I'm going to line up this placket edge to the seam line, which is at 3/8 of an inch. And now I'm going to sew. I get it started and I kind of start looking, you know, at the whole edge here. And so one thing that I do, and I'm going to tell you now, when I set the sleeve onto the garment, 99% of the time, I press the seam allowance of the sleeve towards the front of the garment, not towards the back. And that's because on the garment, I press the seam allowance, the side seam, I press that towards the back. And if I press the sleeve towards the front and the side seam towards the back, it offsets that bulk. Because I know I'm going to do that because it's a French seam, it's not a very bulky French seam, I'm still going to do that. It also seats the seam and it makes them line up really nicely. I don't want to twist this underarm seam, so I'm going to press this underarm seam towards the front of the sleeve when it's down here as well. You can do whatever you like. Just know that I know that my seam allowance is pressed towards the front, and that is why. All right, and so now we're getting close to the end here. We're about halfway. So now we're going to line up our cuff to the other end of the placket at the seam line, just like that. And it's good just to kind of look ahead because between the pleats and the seam allowance and the placket, we've actually, you know, kind of messed around with the circumference of the sleeve in lots of potential ways. So you want to make sure that you're kind of looking ahead and making sure everything's going to line up. Maybe your pleat needs to be a tiny bit bigger to make it fit. You know, just make sure that you're getting it all in there and you don't get any tucks. All right, and then the other thing to think about too is making sure that when you're sewing this edge here and you're sewing the beginning edge here, right, those seam allowances are exactly the same because your cuff needs to line up going across itself when it gets buttoned, right? So now's the time. Start looking at this right now. Clip this thread. All right, and so now we're going to press this cuff. I'm going to finger press this right now because it's such a small space. So I'm pressing the seam allowance towards the cuff right now. All right, and now we're going to fold the cuff right sides together like this. And I'm going to leave this edge unfolded right here. I know almost all instructions have you iron that up. I'm not going to do that. You can iron it up, that's fine. Iron it up now, it might be a little bit easier, but don't sew it that way. We're going to fold the cuff there at that notch, which is the halfway point of the cuff. And then kind of give this a nice little tug right here. You don't want this, you know, pleating right there. And we're going to sew this short edge here. Make sure you're doing it as straight as possible. This is one thing I always get a little bit of an angle. So I also try and make sure that my shirt sleeve down here is kind of straight off of the cuff. I'm giving you lots of tips you didn't ask for, sorry. All right, and so now I make sure, and we're gonna sew right next to this placket here. So you see right there, my stitches are right next to this placket, all right? All right, we're gonna do the other side now. Right sides together. Fold on that notch. Should be right where your seam, your interfacing is. Make sure you tug your sleeve. Stitch right next to that placket. All right, and so now let's look at our cuff right now. Why not, right? Is it folded the same? It's looking pretty good right now. All right, and so now we're going to clip this corner. Something familiar finally, right? All right, and now we're going to turn it right side out. I always fold the seam allowance against it like this and then press it like that. This side didn't look as crisp, so I get my awl in there, Pull it out a little bit, just like that. All right, so this is the inside of our cuff so far. It's already done. Now all we have to do is stitch down the outer, and we don't really care what happens there. I know we care a little bit, but you know what I mean. Like, we don't have to worry about it as much. We just need to worry about what the outside looks like. All right, so we're gonna go to the iron, and we're gonna iron the cuff here, and we're gonna start ironing this edge. But the order I'm gonna do it in is I'm gonna try and press this edge here and press it along the fold line right here. Okay, so I'm going to press my cuff down, my seam allowance towards the cuff there. Let's give it a quick little press. And now I'm going to press it on the seam edge here. And the seam edge over here. And now I'm going to try and get this nice and flat and straight through here on that cuff fold line. Just like this. And so I kind of do it from the inside of the sleeve like this, flatten it out. We don't want any torquing, right? So now we're going to just fold this edge just past the stitching. Just like this. And I kind of do a center one here, and now I'm going to arrange it like this. So I'm going to leave this seam allowance here folded back. And I'm going to now, see how like when I look at this edge right here, and the seam allowance wants to push open like that, fold it back towards the cuff again, and then fold it down like this. I'll tell you why in a second. It'll be easier to show you at the machine. All right, so get that fold lined up. Now we can still fiddle with a little bit of this alignment when we get to sewing it. We're just trying to give ourselves a little bit of a helping hand here. And I'll be really honest with you, a lot of times I don't iron this part. I'll show you how I get away with that too. Any threads you have near this little juncture or anywhere on the cuff, get rid of them right now. They will just make it so much harder. All right, so again, keep that folded back on itself and press it down. And then try and get it like that. Just do your best. It doesn't have to be perfect right now, trust me. We're going to make it perfect in just a second. And this is really awkward, especially for me, because I can't lean over it because of the camera. So I do a lot of this at the machine. All right. If you have an ironing board, it's probably a little bit easier too, because you have the nose to kind of wrap your sleeve around. All right, that looks really good right there. Okay, all right, so now let's start looking things over here. So remember how I said I wanted you to fold this along, like keep it kind of pressed away from each other here. So the seam allowance is kind of turned up and kind of wrapping around here. It makes it a little nicer when it is finishing right here. And so I'll show you the difference. So say this was open like this, and we folded it down like this. And then we tried to finish this edge here. It makes it so this little tail slips down right there. You see it? So instead, open up this. Okay, so this is the short seam. Fold it back, fold it down. And it's wrapping around this little seam allowance here. I know that's very subtle, but it does make it a little easier. All right, and so that's a non-negotiable spot, so we're going to pin that one. We don't want that to move, and we don't want any torquing to happen, all right? So let's do the same over here. Now, if you're doing anything thicker than my fabric here, it's probably a lot trickier than what I'm making it look like, and I know that. I just made one of these in flannel, so I know. All right, and so now So now we have just these two ends here. So another little thing I want you to do to help yourself is pin along the cuff just like an inch away from the fold. Keep it nice and relaxed and flat, just like this. This will prevent any torquing. All right. You'll get faster and faster at this if you, I know this is a lot of little steps. All right, and so now in the center here, find a good like halfway point that's non-negotiable and pin that. I think that's about right there. All right, and so then I kind of just keep chunking it up half, half, half like that, right? And now another halfway. And then this one halfway in between, or at least halfway between those 2 points. Like that. And you can keep going as many as you want. All right, and so now we have this ready to go. All right, and so this is one thing I can't stress enough. When you sew this right now, don't start right here at the end. Don't put your back stitch there, because if you have to make any kinds of adjustments, and I've had to make so many adjustments on my cuffs because of some sewing error, something, whatever, picking out your back tack there, it really stresses out the fabric and you might snag it or something like that. So I'll spare you all the details. Just try and do your start stop somewhere back here. So what I like to do is I do it on the seam, the underarm seam, you know, where the French seam is right here. That's where I do it. I do it right here. That's the underarm, right? No one's going to see that. Except when you're raising your hand, you know, saying, yes, I made this. All right, and I don't back stitch it first either because we're going to back stitch at the end. All right, and so now we just want our fold line to go just past those stitches. All right, let's pull in the camera there. It might be a little too zoomed in. All right, and so we have these stitches there. We want to pull that fold just past it right there, okay? Let's get rid of this pin here. Now remember, the presser foot is trying to push this layer toward me. You don't want it to blump off the edge towards you. So kind of push against it as you sew. Even if you know, make it really short, that's okay. It's going to all even out. And then when you get to the corner, now you can turn. It's an awkward spot to turn there. All right. All right, and so now we're going to go along the fold. All right, and now we're going to come down and then go across back to our start point. We're not worried about what it looks like on the back side because we don't have to catch anything back there. We only need to make sure that this fold is just past that first stitch line right there, right? That's all we have to worry about. And if your needle is landing on the cuff to the right of that stitching, it's going to land on the cuff on the back side too. All right. Take out all your pins. Clip all your threads. You're not allowed to look until you take out all your pins and clip your threads. All right, let's see how it looks here. Sometimes the fold gets caught in my presser foot. Let's see what this side looks like. Not bad. This fabric is very easy to sew. That's my back tack. All right. Let's make sure our cuff matches. That's pretty darn good. And then the other thing you want to make sure is that your placket opening, I know it's getting a little late for that, but we're going to sew another one. So we also want to make sure our placket opening here is the same length right here. All right, let's do our other one. All right, so we have our sleeve opening prepped and ready for the cuff, and here's our cuff. we're going to sew this so that the right side of the cuff without the interfacing is being sewn to the wrong side of the sleeve. All right, and so let's trim any of these little threads near the placket edge here. Get rid of those. They're kind of a pain later, so make sure. And then one thing we want to make sure of is make sure your placket right here is the same length on either side, so that these two pieces here, one isn't shorter or longer. If you need to even anything up, now is the time. So let's look at our thing here, our little placket here. And you can see that there's this little winging out edge there. So let's just trim that off like that. All right. And now we're going to lay our sleeve onto the cuff at the seam line along this short edge right here. So 3/8. And then make sure you sew the sleeve to the cuff at 3/8 as well. And so get all of this straight, all these pleats and everything. Make sure that they're not all rumpled and everything, because they'll kind of lay funny and they might cause you some problems later. All right, and so like I said before, I always sew my underarm seam pressed towards the front of the garment. And so I'm going to do that here. I'm going to press my seam allowance out the cuff towards the front so that it's not twisted on the underarm. All right, and so here we are, getting there. Line up that placket again on the seam line. It's good to look ahead, you know, between all the seams of the placket, the pleats, the underarm seam. It can all get off a little bit. Even 1/8 of an inch can really give you some problems here on the cuff. And it's really easy for all those little amounts that are off to add up. So, all right, here we have it. Okay. So now let's start looking at our cuff width. That looks pretty good. All right, and so now we're going to fold the cuff right sides together, just like this. And so my sleeve is inside out still. And I'm going to line up those short edges there, fold it on the notch or the halfway point of the cuff, and then try and keep all of these edges here like perpendicular to the cuff like that. And we're going to sew at 3/8 of an inch seam. And we're going to go right next to the placket right here, right next to it. Don't fold up this edge. It's okay if you ironed it first, but just don't fold it up while we're sewing this part. All right, we can trim this corner here. And we're going to do the same thing over here. Fold it on the notch. Line it all up. Make sure all these little pleats and the placket are perpendicular to the cuff. So right next to them, keep a parallel seam to the raw edge of the cuff there. Trim your little corner. Turn it right side out. Just like that. And now we're going to start ironing. All right, so first place I iron is we're gonna iron the cuff seam here inside there. Yeah, I'm a little bit reckless when I do that, aren't I? All right, and now we're going to get this edge nice and crisp. This fabric is so cute. All right, and now we're going to do the long edge here. And so I kind of try and hang it off past the seam right there, that 3/8 of an inch. And then I kind of straighten it like this, make sure that I'm getting a nice parallel, even width cuff like that. All right, now we're going to turn under that long edge. And so I'll kind of start here at the center. And then I just start kind of looking at the rest of it. And so like I keep telling you, Make sure you get like this little short edge here, open it up, and then fold it down like that, and then fold it back. So all I'm doing is folding this edge under, but I'm wrapping it around the seam allowance of the end of the cuff, just like that, tucking it in there. See how nice and clean that is? Makes a big difference. All right, so let's pin our cuff here. Make sure that it's what we want. So remember, I do it kind of in, you know, breaking it up by halves. I remember, if you really want to stabilize this edge, and maybe you've already done this, like I keep telling you, this fabric's really easy to work with, so I haven't had to worry about it. But if you're feeling like it's really hard to manage this, pin it right here. Just pin it an inch away from this fold. Get it stable, because if you can rely on the cuff, like a whole chunk of it, if you can rely on it not moving, it makes your life a lot easier. So just pin it down the length of it. That way you know it's not going to shift like this and you won't get any torquing. It just makes it a little bit easier to handle, especially on thick fabrics, flannels, linens, any of those loosey-goosey fabrics, rayon, anything like that. All right, so now I always start at the underarm seam, which is right here. See, there's the underarm seam. I start there. Just make sure that fold goes just past that stitch line that we just sewed, all right? Now, even if you go, like say your fold is just past the stitch line and it's a little bit further than the stitch line, looks great, right? And it's also one way you can combat a cuff being uneven. So say it got sewn a little bit uneven, you can kind of fake it by making the right side a nice even cuff. And even if you stitch below this line, which, you know, on the sleeve side of the line, no one's going to see it on the inside. So it's one way that you can kind of get it back on track. All right, so here we are at the end. I got really close there. The fold edge is nice and simple. All right, and so make sure you don't poke yourself with these pins here. All right, trim your threads, get rid of your pins, and then we can check. All right, let's see, where's my back stitch threads? Right here. And so you can see, like, my stitches aren't quite on the cuff. They don't look bad. They're on the cuff here, they're not on the cuff there. But on the right side, they're on the cuff just fine. All right, now it's time to put our sleeves onto the garment. Okay, now we're going to do our side seams on our shirt and we're going to set in our sleeves. And yes, we're going to use French seams, but you don't have to. All right, so because I am doing French seams, I'm going to be doing this wrong sides together on the side seams. So you can sew yours right sides together if you're not doing a French seam or a flat felled seam. And we'll kind of zip through this since I went through how I do the French seam on the underarm of the sleeve. So we'll just kind of zip through this part. All right, so now we're going to put an easing stitch into the sleeve here at the cap between the notches there. So I don't usually change the stitch length on my machine to do an easing stitch, and I only do one. So I'm going to put it in at about 1/2 inch because the seam allowance is 5/8. So I'm just going to run the stitch along the cap here. Like I said, I just usually use my regular stitch length. And we'll do this one here. This sleeve isn't very hard to set in. There's not a lot of ease. And you probably won't believe me, but I think setting in a sleeve with ease is easier with a French seam. All right, so now I'm going to pull the bobbin thread or whatever thread you want, if I can find it. So I just pull a little bit to the cap, and then I'm going to pull this one here. Pull from each side so that I don't accidentally pull the thread all the way through, which I've done before. And then I have to sew it back in. All right, so just a little ruffly, right? Just a little bit. It's probably even too much, but we'll see. Generally, that's about all I need. Okay, so put your garment right side out, get your sleeve inside out, stick it in the hole, and then line up the underarm seam and the side seam together. See? So we have the cap part of the sleeve goes towards the shoulder. All right, and like I told you before, I always press my side seam of the shirt towards the back and the underarm seam of my sleeve towards the front. And then that way they kind of nest together just like this. See those bulk? All right, and so then I don't use a whole lot of pins when I do this. I just put one here. And then let's find the cap. So remember there's a notch on the yoke right here. So we're going to find that cap notch right here. And we're going to match it to the notch on the yoke. There aren't any other notches besides the front and the back, which are down here. See, there's that single front, and then there's the double for the back, all right? And so now we can kind of just go like this and see how much extra ease we have, and we're actually pretty good there, all right? And that's about all I do. And so because I'm doing the French seam, I'm just going to sew this at the first pass, which is 1/4 inch. And I'm not worried about my easing stitch or tucks. Like, it's okay if I get tucks in this seam right here because this isn't the final seam. And I just keep these raw edges lined up. So you can see this is my back right here. And so I'm to the right of my easing stitch right now. Here's the easing stitch. You can see how I'm getting this little ruffled edge. And so now I just look at this easing stitch and I kind of go, okay, is this evenly distributed? I kind of just like slide it a little bit. So totally okay to get tucks in this seam on a French seam. You kind of have to. All right, and then here, now this side looks like I have a little extra here, so we can just take that and just tug it a little bit more. And then you never are easing anything below these notches though. You want it up at the cap because that's what makes your sleeve more comfortable. And so when these little tucks start coming toward me, I just kind of push them away. We don't want it in the where the easing stitch is. We just want those tucks to the right of the easing stitch. All right, and so I'm approaching the beginning now. And I line it up and I back stitch. All right, and so now we'll do our other one. So same thing, put your sleeve inside out. Here's Here's the garment. So there's our pocket. Stick it in the hole, and we're going to line up the underarm seam. We're going to put the sleeve towards the front, side seam towards the back, nestle them just like that. One pin here. And then we're going to look for our cap notch right there, see it? And then there's the yoke notch, which is indicating the shoulder. Just like that. And let's see how our ease is there. Looks pretty good. I know you get these little like bits that stick up above the armhole there. That's okay. That always happens. It's just because it's curved a different way than the armhole. All right, and then I'm going to do my 1/4 inch seam all the way around. It's a lot of shirt now. Just make sure that you're not sewing it. It's really the fussiest part, is make sure you don't, none of your shirt kind of sucks back underneath the needle. So again, you're gonna sew through tucks, and that's okay. I just try and push them towards the needle so that they're not like collapsing like this. You kind of want the raw edge to stay lined up. You don't really want it to collapse, because then you might get another issue. All right, so keep all your raw edges lined up. We're almost to the beginning here. You're not pulling either. You don't want to stretch out your armhole, and you don't want to take advantage of the fact that it's on the bias right here. All right, and so we're going to go over to the serger, and we're going to trim this edge, iron it, and then come back and finish. Okay, so I'm going to use my rotary knife here. So make sure you get your shirt completely out of the way, like I'm shaking it all the way out of the way. And we'll trim this edge here, just a little bit off. It's okay to get close to that stitch line, but don't trim it off. Don't mistake it for that it's your easing stitch, because it's not. It's your seam. So don't trim it off by accident. All right, and now this is probably the most awkward part, is we're gonna iron this seam. And it is really awkward, but if you have a nose to your ironing board, or you have a ham or something like that, you can make it a little easier. So just press that seam allowance one direction, doesn't matter which way. Just do it the same way all the way around. Pull the sleeve on, I'm pulling the sleeve kind of tight, just like that. All right, and then now you're going to put the sleeve inside the shirt. Oh. Put the sleeve there inside the shirt like that. Right sides together, and now we're going to iron this edge right here. All right, get it right on the seam. I know this is a little tricky, but you're not going to hurt anything. You used a regular stitch length. It's not basted or anything. Like, it's completely sturdy. And see, look at that. I'm kind of forming the curve. That's the bottom of the armhole. Because that's what it wants to sit like, right? So iron it that way. And then do your best to kind of get this right on the edge. Yes, you have little tucks in your sleeve, and that's okay. This is going to make it so nice. You're going to be so happy with it. This is all about fabric handling, in my opinion. I think, like, when you're getting better at sewing, really what you're getting better at is handling the fabric and just letting it know that you're the boss of it. And this is a really good example, because it's just so much going on over there, and you just got to tune it out, you know. And so I kind of get this, you know, the edge, here's my armhole, and you see how I kind of slide it like this, kind of slide it to the edge here like that. We're right on the edge of the seam, and in these areas where there's a juncture, it's not going to want to sit perfectly on the edge, but you're going to tell it that you're not going to take no for an answer. On those really thick fabrics, you're going to just have to be a little patient. Use your steam and all that. All right, so now we have this armhole, so we're going to repeat for the other armhole. Okay, this is the good part. So exciting. All right, so now you're just gonna sew your seam 3/8 of an inch, and it's gonna be super easy because you don't have to do any of the tuck management. You're not worried if it's gonna work or anything. You're just making sure that when you get close to the stitch, where getting close to your gathering, your easing stitch, just make sure there's no tucks. Just kind of move them out of the way if you see one or something, but you most likely won't. It's like the easiest, this is the easiest step. It's almost like you're just sewing a little line of stitches next to it, and the first line of stitches is doing all the work. All right, now back stitch. Okay, trim. Look at that, nice, clean. All right, so now the best part is we're gonna remove the easing stitch because it's just so satisfying to do that. All right, look at that, very nice. Let's look at it on this side, see if we can grab the other side of the easing stitch. Maybe, maybe not. And then remember, always press your seam allowance toward the sleeve, and that kind of gives you that little bump right here, whoop, at the top of your sleeve cap. There we go, like pop it there. All right, let's do our other one really quick. So I'm always sweeping the shirt too, like under here, sweeping it away. I'm always making sure that whatever I'm sewing on is flat, right? So you can't just like barrel into it. Even though it's a very easy step now, you've got to make sure that everything is kind of flat under there. But it wants to just lay against the fabric. I'm always kind of smoothing it like this. You know, like I showed you at the beginning of the ironing, it's like, oh, you know, my armhole wants to be curved like this. So that's what I do. I kind of put it in that shape, and then it makes it a little easier. All right, there's my back stitch and my start stitch. And then we grab our basting stitch, pull it out, just like that. Looks nice and clean. Look at that right side. Once it's pressed, it'll be really nice. Now for the really fun stuff. Okay, so now we're going to put on our collar. So let's get your collar and your collar stand out. You can set your shirt aside for now. And remember, we have that one that is a little smaller, the collar, right? So pull that aside there. And we're going to start with our collars. So I'm going to lay my interfacing against this, and I'm just going to treat it as one layer. And then we're going to put this one right sides together. The interfacing always goes on the top collar. All right, now even though this piece here is a little bit smaller, that's okay. We're just going to make it lay against the edges, the raw edges anyway. So it's 3/8 inch seam. And so I usually keep these unpinned, and I kind of lift it up and I kind of hold the raw edges together. I'm not pulling, I'm not forcing or anything. I'm just trying to make sure that it kind of can line up, because it wants to kind of, you know, lay kind of in the middle. And what you want it to do is you want it to be biased towards the raw edge. So see, I'm kind of pulling this one down here, while making sure those raw edges are lined up. So when I get down here, I'm going to line up these points. Pull that raw edge down, just like that. Pivot, and the same thing. Pull that over. All right, and see, now you see how this collar is up higher than that edge there, and that's okay. All right, now we're gonna trim this corner. I kind of go around the corner like this. So the way I look at trimming corners like this is, you know, all of this, so if this was turned right side out, this little stitched edge would be the perimeter edge of the collar, right? So all this fabric, it has to go inside there, right? Just like this, so you have all this extra there. So I just get rid of all of it. Sometimes just clipping the corner isn't enough. It depends on the shape or the angle of the corner of the collar. Some angles work better than others if you just want to go clip across the point. All right, and so now we're going to turn this right side out. And of course, we're going to iron it. I'm going to use my awl. You can use a point turner, whatever you like. Chopstick for some bigger points can work. I don't use a very sharp awl. This is a tapered tailor's awl, and so it's easier to manage for things like this. Those other, like the stiletto styles, those are pretty sharp. I can't really handle those as well as I can this guy. All right, so let's iron it. And when we iron it, we want to make sure that we're pulling these raw edges now together. And then what that's going to do is it's going to make the shorter edge along the outer edge of the collar there. So make sure you line up these raw edges if you're skipping the ironing part of the video, all right? So first thing I do is I pretend like it's a French seam and I just iron this. It doesn't matter that I'm pressing it one direction. Just iron it all. Just nice and flat. And you can do the little ends too if you want, you know. We don't want to neglect those guys. They're doing a good job, right? Give them a little steam bath. All right, and so now we're going to line up these raw edges like this. Like that. We'll start at one end. And this is the under collar that we're looking at. So just do a little bit. Don't do a ton yet. Just do a little bit, just to kind of get it going. Like that, and hold it, right? And now from the right side, make sure everything's looking really good. And don't be fooled by that interfacing being the raw edge. Make sure it's the collars you're lining up too. All right, and so see that? And so look, see how there's a little bit of collar pulling to the underside? That's so that this little edge doesn't show on the right side. All right, and so here you can see up close there, you can see that little edge you're seeing is the outer collar, the top collar. All right, and so now I'm gonna top stitch around the perimeter. So if you're doing a double needle, this is the time you want to do this, because once we put the collar stand on there, you don't really wanna top stitch around this edge because you don't really wanna back stitch right there. So now is the time to do any top stitching of your collar. And make sure nothing slips. Some fabrics that are thicker are going to fight you on this a little bit, so make sure all of your raw edges are lined up. You can stitch this edge if you like. When you get close to these corner edges, sometimes they can sink down into your feed dog, so be careful. You don't want that to go down there, and then you get kind of stuck and you get all this like thread underneath. All right, so there's our collar. All right, and so now we're going to make a collar sandwich. So let's get our collar stands out here. Lay the interfacing on one collar stand, the outer one. So if you're doing a contrast, you want to make sure that the interfacing is going on the collar stand that's going to face outward. All right, and so lay your collar stand with the interfacing right side up. lay your collar with the top collar, the outer collar, not the one we trimmed, which is underneath there. Lay that on top of it, lining up your centers. Where's my center here? There it is right there. Line up your center. And then take the collar stand that's uninterfaced and lay it on top of there. And now we're going to sew this in. So put a few pins here, secure this edge. And so the edge of this collar here is going to line up to this notch right here on the collar stand. And this can get a little bit, you know, fussy in here. So I like to think of it as being perpendicular because the seam line is right down here. So line it up there. That is also non-negotiable. We'll put a pin here. And now we'll put one at this end here. Lay the collar stand. And so now this is as if we're going to be wearing the collar and collar stand. So see, that's the outer collar stand, that's the collar, and then this will be flipped to the inside. All right, and so now we're going to sew this long curved edge here, 3/8 inch seam. And now make sure that going around this curve, you're nice and smooth. And so one of my tips is don't stop. Just keep going because you'll get a nicer, smoother line. You can do a little bit shorter stitch length so that you're not trying to turn with big clunky long stitches. And then also make sure your seam allowances is pretty accurate right there, especially at the beginning. All right, get rid of my pin. And so now make sure all these raw edges are lined up. And now we're going to go to the other end. Line up all these raw edges directly on top of each other too. You don't, you know, the collar stand's a pretty narrow little guy. You don't really want to start losing width just because you didn't line it up perfectly because you were a little nervous or something, because you might end up making it harder for yourself later on. And you really want your collar stand to be a nice parallel narrow edge. All right, so here we are at the curve. Keep going and try and come down to this edge here at a perpendicular angle right there. Okay, so now we have our collar to our collar stand, and now we're going to trim this edge here a little bit. You can just trim it a little bit, just trim it down, and then we're going to clip the curve as well. So just trim this down so it's nice and even. You don't have to, but I'm imagining right now that you have a little bit of some threadiness going on, and you don't have to trim that off, but you might want to just make sure that the bulk is nice and even. And then I like to trim it mostly because of this curve right here, and it makes this curve a little bit better. All right, and so put a bunch of clips in your curve right here, right up to that seam line. Be careful when you get to the thicker stuff. You don't have to clip the whole area, just the curve. Okay, and now we're going to iron it. All right, so pull that out and just start ironing it. I always pull the bottom one, press the top one towards it, since I only have one hand to pull on things. And we'll go to the other side and do a little bit of it too. And this curve here, sometimes like I have trouble getting that curve to be nice and curvy. And so I'll trim it down more. I'll put more clips, things like that. The other thing you can do is try and iron this, like press this open, the collar stand here, and just press that seam, like, you know, like we've been doing for French seams like this. It really helps make it want to turn right on your seam there. You see that? Look at that. So much better. Okay. All right, let's do it on this side too, because look at this. It's kind of chunky right now, right? There's like little angles in there. And so let's stick our iron in there. Let's lift it up. Press that seam allowance. Doesn't matter what way. I think I pressed the other one the other direction, right? All right, and now let it press, like lay right there on the seam edge. So much better. Okay, so this is the under collar right now and the inner stand. So now let's look at this side here. This is the outer. Your collar stand has a lot of ruffles in it because this pattern has a really big curve around the collar stand, see? So once it's sewn into place, you're going to see that curve is going to spread out. It won't be ruffly like that. See that? All right. Okay. I know I keep saying, here comes the fun part, but this is another fun part. All right, let's do it. Okay, so you get your shirt. If you haven't put in your stay stitch around the neckline, I do that now. If you're not going to do any of the other stay stitches, at least do the neckline, especially if you have one of those fabrics I keep mentioning, like the flannel or a linen or something like that, or hemp, things like that. Okay, so make sure you establish what is the top collar and the outer stand, right? So make sure you know. If you have to like put it on the shirt as if you're wearing it to make sure, do that. That's how this is, right? And so now we're going to do this like I did the cuff. We're going to start from the inside. And so take this collar, see, this is how it's going to be worn. Flip it to the inside so that the inner collar stand is right sides to the wrong side of the neckline. All right, don't get lost in the sauce here. All right, so this is what mine's going to look like. So here's my inner shirt, right? It's getting to be a lot of shirt too. And then like this is my uninterfaced edge of the collar stand. And we're going to lay this center back notch first. All right. And then let's get a few more pins here. Now I'm going to do this right here. Now don't fuss with this right here too much. Just put a pin right here. Pull this apart, and we're going to come back and fuss with this in a second. So just get it fairly lined up. All right, we're not stressed at all. This is going to be awesome. Watch. All right, and so now find your shoulder notch on your collar stand and your shoulder notch on your neckline right there. Another non-negotiable spot. So we're always like halving it, right? Like this half, this half. Let's go over here, same thing. Pull these apart. Roughly line it up because we're going to really do a good job in just a second. These little pins are so short. All right, and then your shoulder notch right there. Shoulder notch on the neckline. All right, just like that. Now that is actually enough pins. But we're going to take a look at this right now, right? And see, do we see anything that might be causing us any issues? You know, like that looks a little bit tricky to set in, but just remember this edge right here is very curved and the other one is curved a different direction. So if you want, you can kind of go, all right, I know I need to get it right here. And remember too, like, we've ironed this, we've had seams, everything kind of leads up to this point where everything affects that final seam, right? All right, so let's talk about this little juncture here. So remember, we're on the inside of the garment. Now, this is kind of like the cuff area. I like to open this up, and I'll even like push this seam allowance right here away, and I kind of lay this placket right there against that seam. Now, if you have a really thick fabric, you need to allow for the thickness of the collar stand and the placket. So what I like to do is, say your placket is really chunky, right? It's pretty thick, right? So when you think about this edge right here, the fold edge right there, that being the spot that's centered on this seam. So maybe you would want your placket like further away, like it can even be like a full 1/8 of an inch away from the edge right here. And that's because like when this wraps around, right, the collar stand, that is going to put the seam centered on that fold. So that's okay to do that. In fact, you kind of have to. It'll make it a lot easier. So this fabric's very thin, very easy to deal with. So I'm just going to line it up right against that seam edge there. And if I want to put the seam allowance, you know, push it back, that's fine. But I'm just going to leave it over there. It's fine sitting over there, so I'm going to leave it like that. And so this is kind of a fussy little spot to pin. So we'll just get a pin in there. And then let's look at the other side here. Same thing, right? Press the seam allowance away on the collar stand or toward the outer collar with the interfacing. Put that placket right up against that seam there. And then put a pin in it right there. Those are kind of your non-negotiable spots, right? All right, and so now the other little thing I do to kind of help myself is I'll start from the center back, go towards the neck, flip it, and do the same thing, center back towards the neck. And I do that because starting from one end here and going all the way down, sometimes, I don't know, it just is a little trickier. So I feel like starting in an easier area kind of sets me up. I like to say it gets my sewing legs under me. All right, so now we have our raw edges lined up, our center backs lined up. If you want to label, you need to put it in right now if you want it in the neckline. You don't need a back stitch, but I just did. All right, and so now we have, right, we have our shirt over here. Get your whole shirt on the table. Don't let it pull on your needle, in your machine, all that, right? So now one thing you need to think about is you're only focused on the seam lines of each of these two pieces lining up. Other things are gonna happen. There's gonna be stuff happening here and a party over there, but you're gonna be focused on just the seam line stacking on top of itself. All the rest of it can do whatever it wants, right? But because there is gonna be some mayhem happening. Now I can feel my stay stitch in there, and so if I like don't sew perfectly and enclose it, I'll go back and fix that later. I'm not gonna worry about that right now. All right, so here's one of my non-negotiable spots. And so I kind of pick up my shirt like this because I can feel little ruffles happening. There's like a little party going on in the living room over there, and you know, hey, we're trying to walk around it. So this part is a little bit of a trickier spot because the curve of this collar stand is pretty steep. And I kind of pull on it, and I pull the collar stand down to line up those raw edges. And I'm also kind of doing this with my hands. You don't want to have to try and fit in any extra towards the end there, right? You need to do it now. All right, so here we are. We're getting close to the end. I feel a little party happening right there, but that, oh no, that's just the edge of the placket. All right, and so look at this collar stand. I'm going to kind of pull it open here and try and sew right onto the end there. I'm going to try and get that angled around. It's a pretty steep curve. Walk your machine, your presser foot, lift it up and down. Let's see how I did there. Okay, not bad. Let's see, is there any tucks here? Is that a tuck? We can work with that. Let's see. All right. Now we're going to go back the other way. Center back again. And maybe we'll find it's easier to do it with the shirt side up. You never know. It is, in my opinion, I feel like it's a little bit, I'm a little nervous that the collar is going to get caught under there. But let's see. All right, so let's get this collar stand like all flat here. We don't want anything flipping up. Pull this pin out right here. Getting close down here. This is when all the parties, we're going to try and avoid all of them right now. We've seen our friend. We're making a beeline to our best friend across the room. Oh, I just felt my little placket stitching starting to come undone there, so don't let that happen. I'm gonna hold it. All right, and my stand, see it's still open there? All right. We're almost there. It's a little tricky. This one's definitely pretty tricky. Okay. We made it to the end there. Pull out our pin. Let's look for any tucks or anything, because now's the time. All right, it looks good. All right, how'd you do? Okay, so now we're going to do our last stitch. Guess what? We only have to finish this seam here and our hem and to top stitch our collar stand, and that's it. And then your buttons and buttonholes. All right, let's do it. Okay, so we can iron this if we want right now. I get kind of eager and excited, and I start kind of looking at it right away. If it's hard to ease the collar onto the shirt, it can be a little bit tricky at this point too. But right now, this is the easier task. And remember, we're on the outside of the shirt, and we're on the underside of the collar. So see, the only part of this stitching that's really going to show is right here at the center front. I know that's kind of a front and center part, but hey, we got this, right? Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So let's clip our neckline. Be really careful, don't cut your shirt. Clip the curves that you have, especially if you feel like it needs it. Most of them do. Yeah, like I say, keep that shirt out of the way. We've come too far. All right. So now let's iron. All right, so press your seam up into the collar. I'm always making it hard on myself, aren't I? All right, press that up there. All right, and so now if you want, you can start ironing your collar stand. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I think it just depends on your fabric. So if you find that you want to start ironing it right now, go for it. If you find you just want to start pinning it and skip the ironing, that is a total strategy too. So I'm just going to kind of look at my little non-negotiable areas, you know, like where the notches are and stuff. And remember, this edge isn't clipped, but the other one is, so that can cause you some issues. And if you need to clip the collar stand a little bit, go ahead. I don't advise just clipping it though, because it can make it really hard to kind of get it onto there. In general, you probably won't have to. So just it's just something to be aware of. All right, so I'm going to start pinning. Okay, so I'm going to start with my center back, and I'm going to fold it just past that stitch line right there. Now I'm going to find my shoulder notch right here, try and find where it goes. Even though I've clipped this neckline, you can sometimes still see where that original clip was. And remember, you don't want to distort your collar stand by pulling it, you know, side to side at all. So just get a few pins in it to see where it's at before you start doing major adjustments. Right here. Fold that like that, and I kind of let it hang loose here and see, okay, is that about where it wants to be? Looks like it. We'll deal with this in a second. We're doing the fun, easy stuff first. Okay. So I can see, like, is that my seam? Okay, that's okay. I'm just making sure that my stay stitch wasn't on the wrong side of that seam. All right, and this is where it gets a little dicey, this curve right here. Just tuck it under there. All right, let's look at the other side really quick. Make sure we don't have any little pleats or anything. Okay, finish pinning the rest of it. Okay, so now when I get here, this is the tricky area, right? And certain fabrics are going to be nicer to you than others, but this, you can do a few strategies. We can fold this all back like this and then turn it under. Now this collar stand, it doesn't come to kind of a point, too drastic of a point, and so this might work. Sometimes that point is just a little too drastic and you really can't fold the edges in there because there's no room for them to go. You know, they want to go past out here because it's too narrow. All right, so now get that point kind of sorted out and now try and ease the rest of this in. And see, look at that. I couldn't quite get that in there. So I have to lift that up. And it's really because it's a matter of the seam allowance trying to fold parallel and equally right there. And so it was just at a weird angle. Because remember, this part of the collar stand, when you remember the the pattern piece went like this. This part of the grain line is like at an angle. And so it's going to want to lay a certain way, those seam allowances. So just let them do their thing. Remember, we're on the right side of the garment, right? So everything we stitch here, this is it. This is all we have to worry about. We don't have to worry about the inside. All right, so same thing. Here's this collar stand, right? Get rid of any of these little threads. They can really plague you later on. Just get rid of them. All right, and then I see, here's my collar stand, and I'm putting my fingers here, and right here I'm going to pinch the seam allowance there, and I kind of tuck it in there like that. I feel like I do so much with my hands, I don't realize how much I'm doing. So tell that, nope, you're going in there. Holding it. I'm doing so much with my fingertips right now, and I know that it can be really frustrating if your fabric is really unruly. Linens love to relax and get stretched out and kind of take a siesta in between the time you cut them and sew them together, you know. Maybe it's more like they're taking a yoga class and they're just all stretched and limber and you're like, wait. You should be a little bit more tense. Okay. So just try not to leave yourself, see, like you can end up leaving yourself this little bubble here and you're trying to ease it in there and this is what happens, right? It goes off the edge. So prevent that now. Tell yourself like, okay, I'm not letting that happen. So I'm going to pin this down right here and I cannot change it. And you might have to sit here and tuck these little seam allowances at edges in there a little bit better. And it's because they're butting up against the seam, like they can't go anywhere. And they're trying to tell you that. You can trim them down a little bit. I don't recommend it because if you have to take this apart or do any adjustments, you won't have any seam allowance to work with. All right, and so look at this little bubble. We're gonna just work that in right here instead. So we're gonna fold in the seam allowance a little better. And we're just gonna try and ease it in using the feed dogs and the awl. All right, I think we're ready to start sewing. Let's just check a couple more spots. Sometimes when I see these big gaps, I think, uh-oh, and then when I lay it out, it's okay. All right, so let's make sure. I did this one already, but there's only one pin and it's coming out. So let's just make sure. I sometimes over-rotate it. I'll pull the collar stand like this a little bit further. Because when my presser foot comes across it, it's pushing it that way anyway. All right, it's okay, I can see my stitches there. I can sort that out with my awl. All right, let's do it. All right, now we're, same thing as the cuff. We're gonna start in the center back here. So let's see how it's looking right now. So see right here, here's this little spot. I've got it tucked in there, just like this. And you know, you can kind of push it in like that, over rotate it, slide more seam allowance in there. make sure that you say this little area, like this first ½ inch right there, that can't move. Ease it in right here. Okay. All right. So we're going to start at the center back neck. Remember, we're on the right side of the garment. So be on your best behavior. All right. We're ready? Ready to have a beautiful shirt? Okay, here we go. Remember, we're on the right side of the shirt. This is the final seam. Doesn't matter how it looks on the inside. I mean, it does, but it doesn't, right? Anywhere your needle lands on here, it doesn't matter. This is all secured. So if you really want to make sure that the stitching lands on the collar stand on this side, you need to make sure your needle is to the left of this seam, right? Or to the right when you're on this side. So I usually pull that fold just barely past those stitches, and then I sew right down along that seam line. All right, so here's my center back. So here's the pleat. I got my awl ready. I'm gonna pull that over a little bit. And remember, you want your whole shirt on the table. Don't let it pull the needle, and make sure that you're kind of adjusting it as you go, because it really changes the angle of how it wants to lay in there. And so make sure I'm managing this little edge here. I kind of hold it with my awl. If you don't have an awl, you can use a knitting needle. You could use the seam ripper, but be careful of using the seam ripper. I find I started using with one of those, and I started trying to use it as an awl originally, and it just causes a little bit of it's not as easy to use. All right, so now I'm getting down to this edge, this end, right? And we're going to turn and go all the way around the collar stand. So we don't want any of this fabric to kind of push toward me, right? So that's why we're managing it right now with the awl, kind of pushing it in. Remember, the feed dogs are pulling, the presser foot's pressing towards me. All right, time to take out that pin. All right, one stitch at a time. All right, now we're going to go around this collar stand. Hopefully, we're going to get a nice smooth curve. You might have to kind of tug it, make sure it gets going with the sewing. Sometimes mine will get into the feed dogs. All right, and so now let me move a few things here. Pull it all through kind of gently. Keep all this nice and flat. And I kind of pull it apart like this. Here's my tail where I started. I'm still arranging my shirt. All right, and so now we're getting down to this collar stand again. We want a nice curve. I have this pin here, and so I'm going to lower it a little bit so that I can sew by this. Oh, it's not going to let me stick it back in, so I'm going to hold it. All right, where's my awl? All right, so let's pull this way. All right, now we can turn our corner. Pull this fabric past that stitch line. There we go. And lift up your presser foot a lot too to kind of distribute any of the extra on your stand, or what feels like extra. All right, we're back at the center. Remember, take all your pins out, clip your threads, and then you can look, all right? Let's see how we did. This looks pretty good. You know, sometimes if you sew too far onto your collar stand, you get this little edge like this. So you have to make sure you don't get too much of a flap there. Stand looks pretty good. Here's the inside. I'm always about full transparency on how my sewing looks. I know I can always do better, but I am not a couture sewist. There we go. All right. One step left. All right, let's do the hem. All right, so now we're to the hem. So we're going to lay our collar and collar stand together. Can you believe you just did your collar and collar stand? Good job. All right, so line up your seam there. And now stretch out your placket here and be really honest about it, right? And make sure they're the same length here, right? So these are actually pretty good. This fabric's so stable, I wasn't too worried about it. But if you did something like matching plaids, you're also probably not worried about it. Like I have had issues where I've only interfaced one placket, and then when I went to do that part of it, they didn't match even though the plaids match. So that is a possibility sometimes. All right, so I keep feeling a pin here. Oh, the pin. Okay. All right, so we're gonna hem this. There's only a 1/2 inch hem allowance, so that's pretty easy, right? So we're going to, let's trim this like this. We'll make this a little more of a smooth transition. So let's look at our whole edge here, especially our side seams, and make sure that they're the same. You don't want to find that out as you're approaching it. All right, and so now we're going to roll hem this. There's lots of ways to do this. My favorite way right now is that, because I used to do things like this, where I would fold in a corner, fold it up, and then fold it down like this, right? Because then I can get this corner edge. Let me show you big like this. When you can see it big, it makes more sense. It looks really nice to not have this little like raw edge, this little corner right here poking out, because this is what I don't like. I don't like this little corner being able to pull out. So I sometimes do that corner, but one thing I really like is a shirt has kind of straight lines, and I like kind of being in line with those. So what I do now is I do double fold it straight, but I sew across this end right here, securing it. And so that's how I've been getting around it. So we just have our phases. All right, so I'm gonna just fold this. And now if you're doing a shirt hem and you find doing these curves really difficult, narrow hem is better. You can also sew a little like stay stitch edge along the fold line and then iron it up right there. That's a really good way to get around it. Ironing it first, you can do that as well. There's a lot of bias here, and I don't find that this is too hard. It's just like that fabric handling thing. So my apologies for making it look like it's not that hard when I know it can be. And I have definitely gotten into a pickle with these hems before and had to start over. I just got it just too far out of whack, you know? So, all right, so I'm gonna try and show you how I do this. So see, here I am getting close to this curve. So I jump ahead. I go to these spots that I know are perpendicular to the seam, right? Like this right here. I know I have to meet that, right? So now I'm gonna hold it. And then I kind of use this finger here to kind of coax it in there, folding it and sewing it at the same time. My shirt's kind of pulling down though, so don't let that happen. That won't help you. So I think the trick with these is trying to maintain a nice even hem allowance. Something, I can always do better at that. And so I don't want any torquing, so I'm going to push that a little bit. I did this in a flannel the other day, and this part was easier. This fabric is going to be a little harder because it's tighter weave and it's less forgiving. So like linens and flannels are actually pretty great for this. And now going this way with the curve is also a little easier. All right, so now we're getting to the center back. Nice flat section, right? So we know this area, we don't want to torque, so we kind of hold it right here, right? That's our spot. And so now I need to kind of do a little bit of a circus act with my other fingers. I may have to let it go. Maybe I started that too soon. So I kind of place it like that. just like that. And then here we are at this side seam. I'm probably a little soon, but here we can pin this, or better yet, we'll use a clip, just like that. See there, this is this funky thing, right? So I'm gonna just kind of tuck that under there. Make it try and be as even as possible in width. I'm kind of gently pulling, using that bias to my advantage. You don't want to pull too hard though, because the hem can flip up, and it might, but you can iron that out. It just might happen occasionally after the laundry or something. Once this is washed though, I find these hems really behave. All right, so here we are at the front again. And so this is when you are, if you're really, worried about your fronts matching, you're like, okay, I've already sewn one, so let's double check. So here we are, and so now we know that we need this one to fold right there. Let's get rid of this thread while we're looking at it. See how it really wants to pull and not behave. So just let it relax a little bit, place it for an inch, say, okay, how about, can I just have an inch? Negotiate with it. But when you get here, you gotta kind of get it under control. All right, so let's fold this on this pin. Because see, look at that. If I let this just do an inch, I'd run out right here. So I do gotta start pushing the fabric toward that curve, right? Like that. See that funkiness? So now I'm gonna kind of coax it in there. I'm the boss. I gotta be a boss somewhere. All right. All right, we're here at the beginning. Don't let this, push toward, past your placket. All right, and then I come to the center and I'm gonna back stitch right there, securing it really good. All right. All right, so here we are. How'd your Cameron go? I can't wait to see it. I hope you're gonna show me or let me know how it goes in the comments. All right, so you probably still need to do your buttons, buttonholes, or snaps. And I just wanna give you a few quick tips on placing them and sewing them. So anytime you have a button or buttonhole, it's usually the buttonhole is usually gonna go parallel to the place you're sewing it. So it goes parallel to this long, narrow placket. So they'd be vertical here, but they'd be horizontal here or parallel to the collar stand right here. And it's the same with the cuff. They're gonna be parallel with the cuff, just like on a waistband or something like that. On something like a little button on the pocket, you're gonna put it vertical here. And sometimes you're putting these because they're high stress areas or they're areas that need to expand and contract, like the cuff and the collar stand. That's more of a comfort thing, especially around the collar stand. You're going to really want that buttonhole to be parallel with it. And that way it'll allow the user a little bit more comfort throughout the day. Now, if you're really short on buttons or you just really don't like sewing them, you can skip a couple. Very often I will just skip the one on the collar stand. Sometimes I'll put the button on, but not the buttonhole. Don't tell anybody. Or I just skip it all together. I never button that one, and so I just find that, hey, why not skip it? It makes it a little bit lighter weight. It's easier to iron, and nobody's ever said a thing or noticed it. In fact, I forget on a lot of my shirts which ones have them, which ones don't. And as far as where you're going to place this first button, there is a guide in the pattern, but you don't have to follow it depending on what size button you're using. And you can put that first button at the top wherever you want. So if you tend to leave your shirt kind of open, maybe you want that first one where you would like your shirt to be open. Maybe you want it all the way up at the top because you get a gap right here when you have buttoned shirts. The other thing to think about is if you have gaping issues on the folds part of the shirt, you might want to put a button right there at that fullest part and then adjust your spacing in corresponding to that fullest part right there. So the other thing to remember is on your cuff, for this particular placket, since we have a wide placket, your button's going to be centered right there in the middle of that placket. The buttonhole is going to go parallel to the cuff. And remember also that the button is the spot where your buttonhole is going to rest. So on something like this, it's the furthest the cuff can expand. So if you don't want your your cuff to get any bigger than this, you're going to want the end of your buttonhole to line up to where you want the button to sit. In other words, don't put the button in the middle of the buttonhole. Put it at the spot where you want the shirt to rest, whether it's the cuff or the center front placket. Remember, the button is like it's like the closet dowel in your closet, and the buttonhole is the hanger. It's going to hang from that little point. And so you want to make sure you put the button at the top of your buttonhole. All right, there's probably a million other things I can tell you about this, but I feel like that's the tips I can easily share with you today. Please let me know how it goes and how your Cameron came out. You can find me on all the regular places, and you can leave a comment here. If you ever want to sew with me, I'd love to see you. Come by anytime. We sew live pretty often, and there's also occasional uploads. Love to see you here. Thanks for watching. Happy sewing. Bye.